Camp Dodge is a military base located in a remote area, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. The atmosphere there is always tense and full of discipline. Every corner is filled with the activities of soldiers who train and work hard to maintain the security of the country. Amidst that strength and discipline, there is a woman who is known not only for her courage, but also for her extraordinary dedication. Sheena Adams, a sergeant who has experience in various major military operations, walks briskly toward the field. Her sharp eyes scan the surroundings, observing the soldiers who are training. She has been through many battles and lost many colleagues. However, what she is most proud of is her ability to always make the right decisions in critical moments. That day, Camp Dodge was undergoing a routine inspection. All soldiers had to be prepared to face strict supervision from their superiors. This inspection was nothing new for Sheena, but that day felt different. Colonel Mark Anderson, a colonel known for his harsh nature, would lead the inspection. Anderson was stubborn and did not like to accept opinions or changes from his subordinates. He believed that all orders must be accepted without question. That was a principle he had upheld throughout his career. Sheena knew that even though she was an experienced officer, Anderson always found a way to belittle anyone he considered not up to his standards. In the field, Sheena stood tall before Colonel Anderson, who began speaking in a raised voice, criticizing the team Sheena had led in several recent operations. "You know, Sheena, I don't know how you still hold this position," Anderson said dismissively. "The crosswind operation you led, it was a mess. You disobeyed orders and stayed on the battlefield to save civilians. That was a foolish move." Sheena looked at him calmly, even though her heart was beginning to boil. She knew very well that the actions she had taken in Operation Crosswind were the right decision. Her team had stayed on the battlefield even though they had been ordered to retreat, because the civilians trapped their needed help. Although they managed to save 45 people, Anderson saw it only as insubordination. "I did it because it was the right decision, Colonel," Sheena replied, her voice calm but confident. "Our job is to protect civilians, not just follow orders that endanger them." Colonel Anderson looked at Sheena with an angry expression. He did not like any defense of the decision he had made. "Don't try to make excuses, Sheena," he said hoarsely, as if insulting Sheena's courage. "You'd better start following orders instead of questioning everything." Sheena could feel the tension in the air. She knew that this was only the beginning of what would become a major confrontation. However, she stood tall, showing no sign of fear. Deep down, she knew that every word that came out of Colonel Anderson's mouth was an attempt to control her, to make her feel small. The entire army around them fell silent. They knew very well how Colonel Anderson treated anyone he considered not to be in line with his harsh policies. However, Sheena had higher principles, justice and truth, which were greater than the orders of a superior. The tension escalated when Colonel Anderson suddenly challenged Sheena in the middle of an ongoing tactical exercise. "If you are so confident in your decision, prove it. I want to see how you execute the tactics you have chosen. Attack from the safer side and prove you're right," he said, looking at Sheena with a sharp gaze. Sheena, who knew very well that this tactic could increase the chances of success, decided to ask for permission to carry out the plan. However, her request was flatly rejected. "You don't make the decisions here, Sheena. Follow the existing procedures," Colonel Anderson ordered without hesitation. The exercise ended in failure. Sheena's plan to attack from the safer side was rejected, and the strategy chosen by Colonel Anderson resulted in losses. The troops were trapped in a difficult position, losing valuable time, and the exercise that was expected to be successful turned into a disaster. Sheena refrained from saying anything, even though her frustration was growing. Colonel Anderson, increasingly angry, turned his gaze to Sheena. "This is all because of you," he said in an angry voice. "You can't follow orders properly. You'd better learn to respect the rules." However, Sheena remained silent, holding back her anger. She knew she had to act wisely. If she reacted emotionally, it would only make things worse. At that moment, Colonel Anderson took an unexpected step. In a burst of anger, he dragged Sheena to the base toilet and forced her to put her head in the toilet water as punishment. Everything happened so fast. The other soldiers who witnessed it could only remain silent, not daring to say anything. However, Sheena was not afraid. In the tense silence, she knew that this was not just about her. It was bigger than just revenge for the humiliation she had received. This was the moment when she had to defend her dignity and teach Colonel Anderson a lesson that no one should treat soldiers like this. With extraordinary calm, Sheena waited for the right moment. As soon as Anderson released his grip, she used the momentum to move her body. In one swift motion, Sheena pinned Colonel Anderson against the wall, immobilizing him with extraordinary strength and precision. With Anderson cornered, Sheena looked him straight in the eye, without fear. "I did not disobey orders to fight you, Colonel," she said calmly. "I did it to save human lives. And I will continue to do so, even if you don't understand." Thus, amidst the destruction and abuse of power, Sheena remained steadfast in her principles. Unbeknownst to her, this incident would change everything. Sheena stood tall, holding her breath, with Colonel Anderson's body still pinned against the toilet wall. The soldiers present at the scene could only watch in shock, not knowing what to do. Some wanted to intervene, but others remained silent, confused about whose side to take. The silence in the room was deafening. Anderson, who was initially full of anger, now began to feel Sheena's extraordinary determination. The anger on his face began to fade, replaced by a deep sense of shame. He knew that even with all his power as a colonel, he could not justify such treatment of a soldier, especially an experienced sergeant like Sheena. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, Sheena finally released her grip, letting Colonel Anderson go from the toilet wall. With determined steps, she moved away from Anderson and looked at him sharply once more. "I will never back down from my principles," she said firmly. "My decisions are always based on humanitarian principles, not just empty orders that disregard human life." Colonel Anderson, unaccustomed to being treated this way, fell silent. He knew he had lost control of the situation, and worse, he knew he couldn't reverse it. However, he wasn't going to give up so easily. Angrily, Anderson turned and walked out of the bathroom without a word. He left Sheena and the other soldiers standing there, silent, confused, and stunned. A few minutes after the incident, a young soldier named David, who had also witnessed the incident, felt compelled to do something. He felt that what he had just seen was an injustice that could not be ignored. Not only that, he also felt that the entire base should know about this incident, about what really happened behind closed doors full of power and violence. David knew that if he remained silent, there would be no change. He began to look for a way to record the incident, albeit cautiously. He used his cell phone, hidden in his pants pocket, to record the conversation between Sheena and Colonel Anderson. Although the video only recorded a few seconds of the incident, he felt that it was enough to prove the corruption that had been going on for a long time. The next morning, David sat in the base dining room with his colleagues. The atmosphere there felt a little awkward, even though no one dared to talk directly about the incident that had just taken place. However, David could not hold back any longer. He decided to speak up. "Hey, you all know what happened yesterday, right?" he asked in a low voice, but loud enough to attract the attention of several soldiers who were eating. Several soldiers turned their heads, and one by one began to listen. Without hesitation, David took out his cell phone and showed the video he had recorded that night. "Look at this," he said as he pressed play. The video showed Sheena calmly responding to Colonel Anderson, pinning Anderson against the toilet wall, and explaining her actions during Operation Crosswind. Although the video was only a few seconds long, it clearly depicted the tension that had occurred at that time. Sheena's confident face and Colonel Anderson's cornered expression gave a very strong picture of what had actually happened. "This is what really happened," David said after the video finished playing. "This is what you all don't know. Everyone needs to know about this." Some soldiers looked shocked, others were silent, and some began to talk about how they had been feeling all this time. They began to realize that there was a lot going on at this base that they didn't know about, a lot of injustice that had been hidden all this time. As time went on, the video David recorded began to spread. At first, it was only among the soldiers, but soon after, the video reached the outside world. Social media began to discuss it, and as the video went viral, Sheena Adams' name became known to the public as someone who dared to fight against a broken system. People began to talk about Sheena's courage in standing up to Colonel Anderson. Several human rights organizations voiced their support for Sheena, condemning Colonel Anderson's violence against his soldiers. Not only that, the public also began to demand clarity about the military training system, which had been considered too harsh and neglectful of the soldiers' welfare. An internal investigation began. All the evidence that had been gathered, including the viral video, made it impossible for the military authorities to ignore what had happened. They decided to open the case and conduct an in-depth investigation into Colonel Anderson's abuse of power. Sheena, who was originally just an ordinary sergeant, has now become a symbol of change. Although many respect her, Sheena remains unsatisfied. For Sheena, this is not about popularity or personal recognition. It is about justice, about fighting for the human values that have long been lost in the harsh military system. However, the road ahead for Sheena is not easy. Despite the support she has received, she knows that this is only the beginning of her struggle. Ahead of her lie great challenges, but Sheena is not afraid. She knows that she is fighting against something bigger than herself, and that is what gives her the strength to keep fighting. The investigation into Colonel Anderson began immediately after David's video went viral. The media, human rights organizations, and the public began to highlight what had happened at Camp Dodge. Although many supported Sheena and voiced their disapproval of Colonel Anderson's actions, not everyone at the base saw it the same way. For some soldiers, Sheena was a hero who dared to stand up to the system, while for others, her courage was seen as insubordination that disrupted military harmony. Sheena herself remained steadfast in her choice. Although she felt honored for her courage, she knew that the ongoing process was the beginning of a longer journey. Her struggle was not only for herself, but for all soldiers who had ever been treated unfairly. In the military courtroom, Colonel Anderson faces serious charges of abuse of power and violence against soldiers under his command. Sheena, along with several other witnesses, is asked to give her testimony. The courtroom is filled with tension, and many hope that the outcome of this investigation will change the face of a military system that has long been considered too harsh and authoritarian. Sheena entered the courtroom with steady steps. Her eyes stared straight ahead, unshaken by the gaze of the other soldiers sitting there. Although she felt anxious inside, Sheena knew that this was a moment she could not waste. This was an opportunity to reveal the truth and fight for justice for all soldiers who had long felt oppressed under a broken system. Colonel Anderson sat on the other side of the room, his face tense and angry. Although he had tried to defend himself with various excuses, he knew that the viral video had shaken his credibility. Not only that, the witnesses who testified about Anderson's violence further worsened his position. "Sheena, tell us what happened that day," said the prosecutor, who firmly asked Sheena to testify. Sheena took a deep breath before she began to speak. "That day, Colonel Anderson treated me and my team in an unprofessional manner. Not only did he belittle us, but he also disregarded the safety of the civilians we rescued in Operation Crosswind. When I opposed his unreasonable orders, he punished me in an inhumane manner," Sheena explained firmly. The entire room fell silent for a moment, listening to every word that came out of Sheena's mouth. Some of the soldiers present at the hearing could not help but feel sympathy for Sheena, who had dared to speak publicly about the injustices that had occurred within their base. After Sheena finished her testimony, other witnesses, including several soldiers who had also been victims of physical and psychological abuse by Colonel Anderson, were asked to speak. They all described how Anderson had abused his authority and treated soldiers harshly, disregarding their rights as human beings. Many of them had been afraid to speak out before, but after seeing Sheena's courage, they finally felt empowered to reveal the truth. The trial lasted several days, with evidence continuing to be revealed one piece at a time. Finally, a surprising decision was made. Colonel Anderson was dismissed from his position, and the entire military training process at Camp Dodge would be reformed. The authorities acknowledged that the existing system needed to be improved so that soldiers could work in a more humane environment that supported their development as individuals, not just as war machines. Sheena felt relieved, but in her heart, she knew that her struggle was not over. This reform was only the first step. There was still much work to be done to ensure that no soldier would be treated unfairly in the future. Returning from the hearing, Sheena sat in her modest room, deep in thought. The medal she had just received lay on the table, but she felt that it was not the most important thing. The award was not for her, but for all the soldiers who had fought against injustice and fought for their rights. "I'm not doing this for medals or praise," Sheena thought. "I'm doing it for a better future for soldiers." Outside, the evening sky was turning red. Sheena looked out the window, feeling the cold night breeze. She knew that greater changes were coming, and she was ready to lead the young soldiers full of potential toward a better future. However, this journey had only just begun, and Sheena would continue to fight for justice, not only for herself, but also for those who could not speak for themselves. After Colonel Anderson's dismissal, many changes began to take place at Camp Dodge. The training system, which used to be harsh and stressful, was now being questioned. Abuse of power, which had been hidden behind the name of military discipline, was finally exposed, and the military had to adapt to the increasingly high demands of the public to create a more humane environment for its soldiers. Sheena felt that this was a victory, even though she knew the battle was not yet over. The decisions made in the investigation only opened the door to greater changes to come. For Sheena, this journey was about more than just stopping one corrupt individual. It was about rebuilding a broken system, about giving soldiers the opportunity to thrive without fear of oppression or violence. Sheena began to receive more attention from her new superiors. They recognized her courage and her ability to lead in high-pressure situations. However, for Sheena, this attention did not make her feel superior. Instead, she felt that this was a new responsibility that she must carry out carefully. In her modest office, Sheena began planning for new, more humane training. She knew that to make significant changes, she had to get support from her colleagues. She began holding meetings with younger soldiers to listen to their views on the training they were undergoing and how they wanted to move forward. Sheena also invited several soldiers who had previously worked with Colonel Anderson to share their experiences and find ways to prevent incidents like the ones they had experienced from happening again. "It's about creating an environment where everyone feels valued," Sheena told the young soldiers at one of the meetings. "We are not just war machines, we are human beings. And we deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, without having to fear our superiors." The first step in the reform was to design training that focused more on balanced mental and physical development, rather than solely testing physical endurance through extreme exercises. Sheena also encouraged the introduction of more open discussion sessions, where soldiers could talk about their feelings and overcome any trauma they may have experienced while on duty. This was something that had been neglected by the previous system. Although many young soldiers supported Sheena's proposal, there were also many who were skeptical. Some of them were accustomed to the old harsh training methods and thought that these changes would only weaken their abilities. However, Sheena never backed down from her stance. She knew that change takes time, and despite the resistance, she remained convinced that what she was doing was for the common good. One day, while Sheena was leading a combat simulation exercise, she realized how much influence she had on the young soldiers. They began to be more open, more confident, and more respectful of each other. In the exercise, the soldiers who had been hesitant began to work better together, prioritizing communication and mutual support rather than focusing solely on individual success. However, even though it seemed like the right move, Sheena knew that the biggest challenge still awaited her. This new training reform would not necessarily be easily accepted by all parties. High-ranking officers, who had long upheld a tradition of strict military discipline, might not easily accept this change. They were accustomed to the old ways, and for them, strict discipline was the only way to maintain order. One night, while Sheena was pondering in her room, a high-ranking officer named General Harrison came to see her. General Harrison was one of the most respected officers in the Army, and he was known as a very conservative figure in his approach to military training. "Sheena," General Harrison said in a deep, serious voice, "I have come to talk to you about the changes you are making. I know many people are beginning to see you as a courageous leader, but I also want to give you a warning. These reforms will not be easy. There are many who disagree with your approach, and you must be prepared to face that resistance." Sheena looked at General Harrison with confidence. "I know that, General. I know these changes will not be easily accepted. But I also know that they are necessary. We cannot continue in the same way, especially if that way only creates more victims." General Harrison nodded slowly, as if he understood what Sheena meant. "You're right, Sheena. I appreciate your courage. But remember, in the military, we are always trained to obey orders, not to fight the existing system. If you are too bold, you could become a target for those who feel threatened by your new ideas." Sheena smiled, even though she knew exactly what General Harrison meant. "I will not back down, General. I believe this is the right fight. I will continue to move forward, even if it means facing resistance. We must fight for a better system, not only for us, but also for those who will come after us." The conversation left a deep impression on Sheena. Although she felt confident in the path she had chosen, she also realized that great change would not come without sacrifice. There were still many obstacles ahead of her, and she had to be prepared to fight, both on the physical and mental battlefields. However, one thing was certain: Sheena would never give up on her principles. She would continue to fight for justice, and in the end, She believed that the military would become a better place for all soldiers, without exception. After several months of reform at Camp Dodge, Sheena felt that there had been significant improvements, even though the road to change was still long. The young soldiers began to show progress in their attitudes and behavior. Training that focused more on mental and physical balance had a positive impact, and Sheena felt that her efforts to change old mindsets were beginning to bear fruit. However, Sheena knew that the biggest challenge still awaited her. Although many supported the changes, there were also many who felt threatened. Several senior officers, who had long adhered to the harsh training system, began to show their displeasure with these reforms. They felt that the system, which had been proven over many years, was being undermined by a new approach that was considered softer and less effective. That morning, Sheena received an urgent call from the commander's office. As soon as she entered the room, Commander Palmer, an influential senior officer, greeted her with a serious expression. "Sheena," he said, "I hear there are some worrying reports about the changes you are making. Some senior officers feel that this new training is weakening the fighting spirit of the troops. They believe we are heading down the wrong path." Sheena looked at Commander Palmer calmly. "Commander, I know that change is not easy. But I also know that we cannot continue to rely on outdated methods. We must prioritize the mental well-being of our soldiers, not just their physical strength. We can no longer turn a blind eye to the trauma experienced by many soldiers." Commander Palmer was silent for a moment, looking at Sheena with a serious gaze. "I understand what you're saying, Sheena. But you have to know that many of the senior officers here feel that this is a step backwards. If we change the pattern too much, we will lose the strength we have had all this time." Sheena refrained from responding harshly. She knew this was part of the struggle. She had to convince them that what she was doing was for the long-term good, even if it meant going against long-standing traditions. "What I am proposing is not to weaken the troops, Commander," Sheena replied firmly. "I just want to make sure that every soldier feels valued and not neglected. If we continue to ignore their humanity, we will only create more victims, and that is not what we should be fighting for." Commander Palmer sighed deeply, realizing that Sheena would not back down. "All right, Sheena. I'll give you a chance to prove that this approach works. But remember, you have to show results. If not, we have to be prepared to go back to the old ways." Sheena nodded, feeling heavy but also relieved. She knew that this was her last chance to prove that her reforms could bring about positive change. She had to show that a balance between physical and mental training was not only beneficial to the soldiers' well-being, but could also increase their effectiveness on the battlefield. The following days were filled with hard work. Sheena resumed leading training sessions and held more discussion sessions with the soldiers. This time, she also invited several senior officers to see firsthand how the new training methods were being implemented. Sheena wanted them to witness the results of her approach for themselves and prove that soldiers who were trained with attention to their mental balance would be better prepared on the battlefield. However, there was something bigger on Sheena's mind. A few weeks after her meeting with Commander Palmer, a new threat emerged. A very conservative senior officer, Major Stevens, began to speak out more loudly against Sheena's reforms. He felt that Sheena was a threat to the long-established power structure within the military. Major Stevens began spreading his opinion to other fellow officers, criticizing Sheena's approach, which he considered too soft. He argued that the military must remain tough and must not lose the discipline that had made them formidable. He called Sheena's reforms a dangerous experiment. "We cannot change the way we train soldiers just because of a few voices from below," said Major Stevens in a secret meeting with several other senior officers. "If we start letting them talk about their feelings, we will lose our power. Sheena must be stopped." News of Major Stevens' dissatisfaction and that of several other officers began to reach Sheena's ears. She knew that the resistance would grow stronger. Although she had the support of many young soldiers, she realized that the power of the old system was still very strong. She had to be careful and prepare for a more organized attack. At the same time, Sheena felt increasingly isolated. Some officers who had previously supported her were now beginning to have doubts, influenced by Major Stevens' increasingly strong opinion. Sheena could not rely solely on the support of young soldiers. She needed to involve more parties in this reform to ensure that the changes she had made would last. However, she would not back down. She knew that this was a decisive moment. If she succeeded in overcoming this challenge, she would change the entire military system forever. But if she failed, everything she had fought for might be destroyed. Sheena sat at her desk, staring at the piles of documents and reports. Although the reforms she had implemented were beginning to show results, she knew that her greatest enemy was not only coming from outside. Major Stevens and his group of conservative officers were strengthening their resistance to the changes Sheena was promoting. They were not only talking behind her back, but were also beginning to organize open resistance against her. The situation at Camp Dodge was heating up. As a leader, Sheena had to devise a strategy that relied not only on physical strength, but also on wisdom and the ability to win over those who were hesitant. However, the pressure was mounting. Every decision she made felt like a big gamble. If she failed, the entire system she was fighting for could collapse, and she knew it. One bright morning, Sheena received a call from Commander Palmer. His voice sounded firm, even a little anxious. "Sheena, there's bad news. Major Stevens and his group are starting to pressure more officers to oppose your approach. We need to find a way to resolve this immediately." Sheena sighed deeply. "I know, Commander. I've heard many rumors. But we can't back down now. If they want to fight, we have to be ready to fight smarter." Commander Palmer was silent for a moment. "I know you're strong, Sheena, but this isn't just about fighting them. It's about changing the way we think, the way we train our soldiers. If we fail, we may end up back on an even worse path. Make sure you have enough support." Sheena stared out the window of her room, deep in thought. She knew that without stronger support, it would be impossible for this reform to survive. If she continued to fight alone, she would eventually become an obstacle that would be crushed by the existing system. However, Sheena also knew that she couldn't just give up. She had to find a way to win over those who were still hesitant, to convince them that what she was doing was for the good of the entire army, not just for herself. That night, Sheena invited several officers who still supported her to a closed meeting. They sat around a long table, their faces serious and full of concern. Sheena began to speak with confidence. "We know who our enemies are, but we also know who we are fighting for. If we don't act now, we will lose the opportunity to make real change. We are not only fighting them, but the entire outdated system. And we must be prepared to pay the price." One of the officers present, Captain Davis, nodded. "I agree, Sheena. We can't just go with the flow. We have to be part of this change, and we have to do it together." However, another officer, Lieutenant Ramirez, cautioned, "But we have to be careful. If we are too open, Major Stevens and his group will become stronger. They have already started to put pressure on more people. If we are not careful, we could get caught up in a big confrontation that we cannot win." Sheena looked at them one by one, understanding their concerns. "I know the risks we face. But this is a struggle we cannot avoid. We've come this far, and we can't back down now. If we want to ensure that the training we do can provide long-term benefits, we must have the courage to fight this broken system." That night's conversation ended with an agreement. They would unite and work together to prove that Sheena's new approach really worked. They would prepare a report showing the tangible results of the changes that had been made, as well as delving deeper into the positive impact on soldiers' morale and their effectiveness on the battlefield. The next day, Sheena led her team to collect data that would prove that this new training method not only benefited the soldiers' well-being, but also improved the results of combat simulations and tactical exercises. They began a comprehensive evaluation of the soldiers' performance, exploring how their mental and physical abilities had developed during training that focused more on balance. However, behind the scenes, the threat from Major Stevens was becoming more apparent. His group of conservative officers was becoming more organized, trying to pressure those who supported Sheena to join their side. Some soldiers began to feel torn, feeling caught between supporting reform or following the old ways that were more familiar and accepted by many. Sheena knew she had to act quickly. She decided to meet with Commander Palmer once again. This time, the meeting feels more intense. "Commander," Sheena says firmly, "we can't wait any longer. We have to fight them in a more strategic way. If we just defend ourselves, we will lose. We have to build a larger alliance within this base. If we can gather more support from young soldiers and officers who really want change, we can turn things around." Commander Palmer nodded, realizing that Sheena was right. "All right, Sheena. Let's start planning the next steps. We will involve more parties and ensure that this reform is not just about you, but about the future of the entire army." Sheena felt her spirit reignite within her. She knew that this battle was bigger than any before. If she succeeded, she would change Camp Dodge forever. But if she failed, she would have to face consequences greater than she could ever imagine. That night, Sheena felt a heavier burden than ever before. Although she had made many positive changes, the reality on the ground was much more difficult than she had imagined. The young soldiers who supported her began to feel isolated, some conservative officers became increasingly vocal, and the tension among the soldiers grew more palpable. Even some soldiers who had initially supported the reforms began to doubt her approach, especially after pressure from Major Stevens. However, Sheena couldn't just let everything fall apart. She knew that this was a turning point. If she could gain more support, she would have the power to fight the group of officers who wanted to maintain the status quo. Sheena decided to act more cleverly this time. A strong alliance was the key to winning this battle. That morning, Sheena gathered the officers who had been supporting her, including Captain Davis and Lieutenant Ramirez, for a closed-door meeting. They had to plan their next move, a more structured strategy to gain more support within the base. "We need to find a way to make this reform bigger than just Sheena's idea," said Captain Davis. "We need to make the entire army feel that this is a shared struggle. This is not about individuals, this is about our collective future." Lieutenant Ramirez suggested that they start involving more senior soldiers, who had gone through long, hard training but were still open to change. They may not support change right away, but if we can show them that this new approach won't weaken them, we may be able to get their support. Sheena nodded, thinking for a moment. That's what we have to do. We need to approach those who are hesitant, who feel stuck between two worlds. If we can convince them that we are not against them, but are trying to make things better, then we can start to see real change. The first step in their plan was to hold open training sessions where officers who supported Sheena would demonstrate the success of the reforms they had implemented. They would involve more senior soldiers and try to convince them that change was not a threat, but an opportunity to improve their skills. If we can show that this new training actually makes soldiers more prepared and more confident, they will start to change, Sheena said with confidence. The following days at Camp Dodge felt increasingly intense. Sheena and her team began to prepare everything more thoroughly. They organized training sessions that included various combat simulations combining mental and physical approaches. The goal was to show that mentally balanced soldiers would be more resilient on the battlefield, have better endurance, and work more efficiently in teams. Meanwhile, Major Stevens increasingly spread his influence. He tried to convince senior officers and other soldiers that the new training implemented by Sheena would turn Camp Dodge into a weak place, where soldiers were no longer trained to face the harsh realities of the battlefield. "We can't continue with this experiment," he said with conviction. "We must return to our old ways, or we will lose our strength." However, even though Major Stevens continues to try to undermine the soldiers' morale, Sheena begins to see small changes. Some officers who were once skeptical are now beginning to discuss the new training more openly. They have witnessed firsthand the results of the more balanced training, seeing how the young soldiers have become more confident and work better together. In a final training session led directly by Sheena, the soldiers appeared more prepared and calmer in facing stressful situations. They worked together in combat simulations, supporting each other and relying on their mental and physical abilities. There was a clear change. These soldiers were not only running to win, but also working together to protect each other. After the training ended, Sheena saw several senior soldiers who had been skeptical begin to approach her. They nodded, seemingly beginning to understand the value of this new approach. "Sheena," Captain Davis said after walking around with several officers, "we're starting to see a difference. It's not just about physical training, but about building a stronger mentality." It was a small but important victory for Sheena. She knew that even though there were still challenges ahead, she had begun to build a larger alliance within Camp Dodge. Although Major Stevens was still trying hard to stop this change, Sheena now had many people ready to support her. However, the struggle was not over. After the training, Sheena received news that Major Stevens was planning to meet with Commander Palmer, and she knew that this was a big step towards the final confrontation. If Stevens managed to get the commander's full support, Sheena could be forced to retreat, and all the reforms she had fought for could be destroyed. Sheena knows this is the moment that will determine the fate of all the changes she has made. If she fails, everything she has achieved could collapse in an instant. However, she remains steadfast. There is no turning back. This battle is not only for her, but for every soldier who wants to see the military become a more humane and respectful place. That morning, the air at Camp Dodge felt heavier than usual. Sheena stood at the window of her office, staring outside with a heavy heart. Today was a decisive day. Major Stevens had arranged a meeting with Commander Palmer, and Sheena knew that the outcome of that meeting would greatly affect the future of the reforms she had been fighting for. If Stevens succeeded in gaining the commander's full support, then everything she had done would be in vain. However, Sheena could not back down. She had come too far to give up. Every step she had taken, every small battle she had won, had brought them closer to real change. If there was a chance to ensure a better future for young soldiers, she had to fight for it. The night before, Sheena had held a closed meeting with several officers who supported her. They had devised a plan to counter Stevens' influence and ensure that they had enough support from the soldiers in the field. Sheena knew that this change was not just about fighting Stevens. It was about proving that the new approach she was offering could produce better results, not just theory. When she entered the meeting room, Sheena felt the tension thick in the air. On one side was Commander Palmer, looking anxious, and on the other was Major Stevens with his group of conservative officers sitting upright, as if waiting to press their decision. Sheena knew that this was not just an ordinary meeting. This was the final battle, where the fate of Camp Dodge's military reform would be decided. Commander Palmer opened the meeting with a heavy voice. "We are gathered here to discuss the next steps for Camp Dodge. As you all know, there are differences of opinion regarding the newly implemented training approach. Let's start by giving Sheena a chance to explain." Sheena stood firmly, her face showing the confidence she had grown over time. "Commander, colleagues, I stand here not to impose my views, but to show the results we have achieved. Training that is more balanced between physical and mental aspects has increased the effectiveness of our soldiers. We are not only training their bodies, but also strengthening their minds and hearts. And the result? Our soldiers are now better prepared, more confident, and more capable of working together as a team." Sheena paused for a moment, looking at the officers sitting across from her. This is not just about fighting enemies on the battlefield, but also fighting the fears and uncertainties within ourselves. We must treat soldiers as human beings, not just as tools of war. We must give them the opportunity to develop to their full potential. Sheena then turned her gaze to Major Stevens. "I know that many of us are still skeptical about this change, but I want you all to see what we have achieved. Soldiers trained with this new approach have shown significant improvement in combat simulation exercises. They are calmer under pressure, more decisive, and better at working together." Major Stevens, who had been Sheena's staunch opponent, stood arrogantly. "Sheena, I understand that you want to bring about change, but we cannot continue to experiment with the way we train our troops. This is the military, not a place for social experiments. We have been training soldiers this way for years, and it has worked. You will only weaken the troops with this approach." Sheena looked at Stevens calmly, realizing that she had to face this resistance head-on. "Major, I understand that we all have different perspectives, but I'm not trying to tear down what already exists. I just want to make sure that we also prepare soldiers for challenges greater than just physical strength. We must train them to be complete soldiers, mentally and physically." The debate grew heated, but Sheena remained patient and calm. She knew that to win this meeting, she couldn't let her emotions get the better of her. She had to convince Commander Palmer and the other officers that what she was doing was for the long-term good. If we continue to focus only on rigorous physical training, we will lose many soldiers who may have great potential but are unable to withstand excessive mental pressure. I see tremendous potential in our young soldiers, and I don't want them to feel trapped in a system that only measures their physical strength," Sheena continued. After a heated debate, Commander Palmer raised his hand, stopping the discussion. "I think we've heard enough. Now it's time to make a decision." Suddenly, one of the senior officers who had been silent, Captain Reynolds, stood up. "I don't think we can continue to turn a blind eye to the fact that we have seen positive results. Although I was skeptical at first, I am beginning to see a change in the soldiers who have been trained with the new approach. They are better prepared and more confident. I think we should give this method another chance." Several other officers began to nod, and the mood in the room began to change. Sheena felt hope rising again. Although resistance from Major Stevens and his conservative group was still strong, there was a glimmer of light. Change takes time, and now, more officers were beginning to realize that the old system could not continue. If we really want to prepare our troops for greater challenges, we must give them the tools to survive, both physically and mentally, said Sheena, reaffirming her commitment. Finally, after a long discussion, Commander Palmer made his decision. We will continue with these reforms under closer supervision. Sheena, I am giving you the opportunity to continue with the approach you have implemented, but we will continue to monitor the results. If there are significant changes in the soldiers' performance, we will expand the implementation of this method to more divisions. Sheena felt relieved, even though she knew that challenges would continue to arise. However, this small victory was proof that change was possible, and she was ready to move forward to create a better future for all the soldiers at Camp Dodge. As she left the meeting room, Sheena looked up at the clear sky. She knew this was only the beginning of a long journey, but with every step she took, she was getting closer to her goal of creating a more humane and appreciative military for her soldiers.